Unbiased News is a myth. Ground News is a news comparison platform that empowers you to see how the political biases of different sources are influencing the news you read. Download the Ground News app for free at davidpakman.com/ground. So yesterday was the first day of the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, and we had some hints that it was going to be an absolutely embarrassing, pathetic attempt at an impeachment defense. And one of the reasons we thought that was that multiple times in legal briefs submitted by Donald Trump's various beleaguered legal teams, they misspelled United States. They misspelled it as Unitas States. And that probably was not the auspicious start that they were going for. And it ended up being an absolutely farcical presentation. Yesterday was a day, it was day one, but at the same time, it wasn't, in the sense that the topic of 4 hours of debate yesterday, 4 hours of presentations, rather, there was not debate among senators. The reason for yesterday's 4 hours of presentations was merely to convince the Senate one way or the other about whether the Senate has the authority and the jurisdiction to hold an impeachment trial of a president that is no longer president, a former president, a past president. And why you would have the Senate decide about constitutionality, I don't know. And many legal scholars were not clear as to why the Senate was being put in the position of having to decide whether it was constitutional. But that's what yesterday was about. The Senate decided, not by a huge margin, 56-44, that yes, the Senate can hold an impeachment trial of a president who is no longer the sitting president. Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin opened the proceedings as one of the impeachment managers. He spoke really well. Included in his presentation an absolutely devastating video of what happened on January 6th, cutting back and forth from what Donald Trump was saying and what was happening at the Capitol. And then it was it was Trump's lawyer's turn. And a guy named Bruce Castor spoke. We covered it live, and he droned on for about 50 minutes about nothing germane to the impeachment of Donald Trump. Now, you might say, well, that must be an exaggeration, David. It must have been somewhat related to the impeachment. I couldn't figure out how. Our live audience of about 40,000 people couldn't figure out how it was related. Bruce Castor going on about British law before the Revolutionary War, his personal relationships with some of the senators in the chamber. It's absurd. It's unintelligible. Let's look at some clips. Here is Bruce Castor starting with his own childhood and the political preferences of his parents.
When I was growing up in suburban Philadelphia, my parents were big fans of Senator Everett Dirksen from Illinois. And Senator Dirksen recorded a series of lectures that my parents had on a record. And we still know what records are, right? On the thing you put the needle down on and you play it.
So that type of stuff went on about 10 minutes. Then Castor started talking about how cool and great senators are as individuals and how senators tend to like the states that they are from.
Their families. They love the states that they represent. There isn't a member in this room who has not used the term, I represent the great state of fill in the blank. Why? Because they're all great? Yeah. But you think yours is greater than others because these are your people. These are the people that sent you here to do their work.
It genuinely seemed like maybe Bruce Castor prepared for some other trial about something different than the impeachment of Donald Trump, because none of what he said made any sense. It became like an open mic night, which then continued with more discussion of what it means to be in the United States Senate as far as Bruce Castor was concerned.
So senators are patriots. Senators are family men and women. They're fierce advocates for the great state in which they represent. And somewhere far down that list of attributes, way below patriot, and way below love of family and country, and way below fierce advocates for their states, far down, at least that's what I thought, anyway, and I still think that. Somewhere far down that list, senators have some obligation to be partisans.
If you're wondering what on earth he's talking about, did you miss something? We were all wondering that yesterday. It made no sense whatsoever. I had no idea what this guy was talking about. And indeed, Donald Trump was not happy. We'll talk more about this later in the show, but here's a report from CNN about just how displeased, and rightly so, how displeased Trump was with this.
Not think that was a strong opening argument, and then to have the first attorney admit that he believed the House impeachment managers did a good job also was confusing to a lot of people on the president's team. But yes, Trump was not happy with that performance. He was borderline screaming over what was going on as he was talking to people about this.
It wasn't just Donald Trump who was not pleased with what Bruce Castor did. Fox News host Sean Hannity himself couldn't even resist mentioning multiple times that it was a meandering presentation that Hannity didn't really understand. Here he is saying it to Republican Senator Ted Cruz.
I thought it was a little bit of a weak start. I'm not being critical, just a little lackluster, meandering to me. Needed a little more focus.
Needs focus, meandering, quite an understatement if you saw the 50 minutes of atrocities from Bruce Castor there. And then this is even better when interviewing Donald Trump's other lawyer, David Schoen. Again, Hannity says he didn't really understand that first part.
Your arguments, I loved your passion. I thought it started a little meandering. It was sort of like a lot of free associating in the beginning, and I'm not attacking your partner. I don't know him at all.
So even Sean Hannity has to concede, in his own words, in his own understated way, this was absolutely off the wall bonkers. And it was also even some Republican senators that noticed this. Here is Republican Senator Bill Cassidy saying, I didn't know what he was talking about. If I just have to vote based on what I see there, they didn't make the case, Trump's lawyers, for anything.
You listen to it, it speaks for itself. It was disorganized, random, had nothing. They talked about many things, but they didn't talk about the issue at hand. And so if I'm an impartial juror and I'm trying to make a decision based upon the facts as presented on this issue, then the House managers did a much better job.
It was really like a verbal ink blot, free association, a kind of senatorial Rorschach test of sorts. Here's 50 minutes of words, mostly words. What can you make out of them? What do you see in there? And even many Republican senators saying, I can't see anything in there. That doesn't make any sense. As I was watching it, with our audience on the live stream yesterday, I was saying, does Trump fire this guy by today? As of yet, he has not been fired. But later on in the show, we are going to have a report about what exactly was going on with Donald Trump, including apparently screaming as Bruce Castor was making his presentation. We'll see if day 2 goes any better for Trump's legal team. That's coming up a little bit later today. Okay, we are continuing to learn about who the individuals involved in the January 6th Trump riot are and who they were and what areas of society and industry they came from. Now, I already told you, it was either last week or maybe the week before, that members of the military, current and former, were dramatically overrepresented among the Trump rioters on January 6th. Something like 14% of those arrested were either former or current members of the military. That's very concerning. And we now have another individual story. 14% is a general number. We now have an individual story that's even more horrifying. According to Time, a man who authorities say is a leader of the far-right Oath Keepers militia group and helped to organize other extremists in their participation in the January 6th Trump riots. Number 1, held a top-secret security clearance for decades, and number 2, previously worked for the FBI, according to his own attorney. Now, you might be wondering, why is this guy's own attorney saying these things? It raises more concerns. It should make us horrified that that was the position this guy held. Well, His attorney is raising these issues to justify that he should be out on bail and that he's super trustworthy and you don't have to worry about him. The man's name is Thomas Caldwell. Authorities believe that he has a leadership role in this extremist group called the Oath Keepers. He was FBI section chief between 2009 and 2010. This is not any FBI person would be a real red flag in terms of their participation. But this was not a nobody to the extent that there are nobodies in the FBI. This was a section chief from 2009 to 2010. Previously, he was in the Navy. Again, we talked about the overrepresentation of members of the military among the Trump rioters. And his lawyer, Thomas Plofshin, wrote in a motion saying, listen, look at this guy's creds. You can safely release him as he awaits trial because he was in the Navy and he was FBI section chief. And the reason why you can trust him is he had this top secret security clearance and he worked for the FBI and he had a consulting firm that did work for the U.S. government. This guy's trustworthy. And of course, as many of us learn more and more about the individuals involved in the January 6th riot, we are horrified. We are horrified about, wow, I mean, listen, people can change in 11 years, right? This guy was FBI section chief from 2009 to 2010. In 2021, he finds himself participating in the Trump riot. Many of us would logically be led to ask, did the FBI miss signs about this guy back in 2009? And the counter argument will be, well, no, the FBI could have done its job at vetting in 2009. There really might have been nothing there then. And something happened since then that ended up radicalizing this guy to the point where he's part of the Oath Keepers, this right-wing militia group, and he's participating in the January 6th riots. But we all should be asking, who else is in there now? Who's in the military now? Who's in the FBI now that has these same ideas, the same ideology, the same allegiances, for lack of a better term, as this guy, and we just don't know about that yet. That is a very, very concerning element of this. And the truth is we should be horrified that these are the individuals that not just participated, but allegedly were organizers of the Trump riot. This is essentially a terrorist. This is someone who organized others to attempt a violent insurrection because they didn't like the results of a democratically held election. There's really no other way to define what these folks are. And the other kind of, a few people wrote to me and they said, you know, it's interesting that this guy Caldwell is now, he's disabled legally. He is on disability and he's on the government dole, so to speak. And people were pointing out two things. One is less interesting to me. Some folks wrote to me and said, David, this guy clearly is not disabled because he was able to participate in the riots. I think that that's the wrong angle to go at. I think it starts to get into these sometimes prejudicial or discriminatory things about what does a disabled person look like? And I don't like that. I'm not going to go in that direction. The part that is more interesting from a political standpoint is that a lot of anti-government extremists are sometimes completely dependent on the government. And that reminds me of, you know, keep the government out of my Medicare sort of stuff, where do people not understand where their benefits are coming from? Or do they not care? Are they blinded by ideology? Is it some combination of all of the above? That's more interesting to me. Evaluating whether someone is or isn't truly disabled based on whether they're at the riot, I'm not going to get involved in that. But the numbers continue to be concerning. 14% of those arrested, former or current military. We now are learning more about individuals who were relatively high-ranking folks within agencies up to and including the FBI. This should horrify all of us. We know that the military has been looking at white supremacy within its ranks for some time. But what is the FBI doing? What is the CIA doing? How many of these folks are in there within the system? And what does that mean going forward when we think about federal responses to events like this, which hopefully will be very infrequent, but history tells us it is bound to happen again at some point, and how prepared will we actually be? Let me know your thoughts. You can find me on Twitter at @dpakman. We'll be back and much to discuss today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The riots at the Capitol made it very clear that misinformation is one of the biggest problems that our society faces, and online filter bubbles make the problem worse, making it difficult even for intelligent news consumers to figure out what's true and what's not. One of our sponsors is Ground News, which is a platform with a really effective approach to combating this problem. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform that lets you compare how sources from across the political spectrum are covering a story. I use it myself. I love it because it lets me easily see how different news outlets are manipulating a story to fit their own narrative. And it shows you your news blind spots, stories that your side of the political spectrum may not be giving attention to. Start out 2021 with a balanced news diet. Download the Ground News app for free by going to davidpakman.com/ground. The link is right underneath this video.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Remember that the David Pakman Show is primarily sponsored by viewers and listeners like you. Grab yourselves a membership at joinpakman.com. Coupon code BETTER21, always available. We talked last week about a poll that showed that 64% of current Republicans are willing to leave the Republican Party if Donald Trump were to start a third party. And this reinforced the sort of soft nature of much of the support of the Republican Party, as well as the cachet that Donald Trump, at least now, as we approach 1 month since he's been out of office, that for at least now, Donald Trump still has on the Republican Party. But that is all hypothetical. Those are people who would be willing to leave the Republican Party. What about people that are leaving, and not because Trump started another party, but just because they're leaving? There's a very interesting series of studies, many of them out of California, some out of Florida as well, which show that there are already thousands and thousands of voters in some counties that are leaving the Republican Party. And where they are going remains a question, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But this seems to be a reaction to the defeat of Donald Trump, combined with 2 months of lies about the election supposedly having been stolen from him. And voting experts at the University of Florida say that there are thousands and thousands of Republicans that are or traditional Republicans that are no longer registered as Republicans anymore, and that while there are often changes to party registrations all the time, and in particular after elections, that the number of Republicans leaving the party are significantly greater in number than the number of Democrats that are changing their registrations. They looked at San Diego County in California, as well as some other parts of the country, and it appears as though the January 6th Trump riot was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back. It's unclear that it alone is the explanation for why so many Republicans are abandoning their party, but rather the sort of culmination to months and really years of a complete joke of a Republican Party with Donald Trump at the helm, at its head. And it is believed indeed that the abandonment of the Republican Party by these folks is a sort of rejection of Trumpism more than it is of what the Republican Party used to be. These folks who are leaving widely believed to still be in line with whatever values or ideologies brought them in the first place, whether it was Ronald Reagan 40 years ago or whether it was someone like either of the George Bushes, or more the Newt Gingrich style early 90s politics that attracted people to the Republican Party, or folks like John McCain and Mitt Romney, more recent Republican nominees. Whatever it was that brought them in, they're not leftists. They're not leaving because they're leftists, but they're leaving as a rejection of Trumpism is what it seems to be. Now, there's a really important and obvious question to ask if we want to figure out what is or is there an electoral impact to this, which is, okay, if you leave the Republican Party, are you still voting for Republicans? Unless we have reason to believe otherwise, they probably are. You can leave the Republican Party and be an independent and still vote just for Republicans. And I can't imagine that many of these folks are looking to vote for Democrats at the state and local level. Maybe some would stay home, which would still be help to the Democratic Party. And sadly, I believe most of these folks will be very quick to return. If indeed what they're doing is rejecting Trumpism by leaving, as soon as the media focus gets back to Black Lives Matter is terrible and Joe Biden's allowing immigrants into the country and the debt and the deficit and all of that tried and true stuff that we predicted Republicans would go back to after Trump and that we're already seeing them go back to after Trump, I believe many will return to the party. And importantly, I don't think many of these folks will opt to vote for Democrats rather than whatever Republicans they can vote for in 2022 and in 2024, assuming Donald Trump is not the nominee at that point in time. So, independents who used to be Republicans that still vote for Republicans, not super interesting. And it's important to know as a general political concept, when we talk about independents, there are some folks who like to frame themselves as these enlightened centrists that are not loyal to either party. And sometimes they vote for Republicans or for Democrats or Green Party or whatever. The vast majority of independents vote overwhelmingly for one party or the other. And they are essentially as partisan as most Democrats or Republicans. They just aren't officially affiliated with any party. And let's not overstate the importance of party registration alone. Now, that being said, if a lot of Republicans are abandoning the party, if some of them are saying, for the time being, I'm not going to be donating, these are things that could make a difference. The question then becomes, will Democrats take advantage of it? And that certainly remains to be seen. Former vice presidential candidate and former governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, a big Trumpist, was interviewed by Good Morning Britain. And it is absolutely nuts. And, I jokingly said 10 days ago on Twitter, remember when Sarah Palin was the craziest person in the Republican Party back in 2008, and how now she seems so moderate compared to some of this wacky QAnon stuff. Then I saw this interview from yesterday, and now I'm thinking, no, Sarah Palin's just as wacky as a lot of these QAnon people. Let's look at some clips here. We'll dive right in. First question to Sarah Palin was, does Trump bear responsibility for the January 6th riots?
The president told those who were attending the rally to go protest peacefully and patriotically and legally. So so these idiots who did storm the Capitol, and now they're blaming the president for their own actions. I think that's a symptom of a societal problem where people just cannot take responsibility for their stupid and criminal acts.
The hilarity of Sarah Palin saying this is about people being unable to take personal responsibility for their actions. That's what started this entire thing. That's what got us here. If on November 8th, which was the day that the media called the election for Joe Biden, if on November 8th, Donald Trump and Republicans took responsibility and said, we lost, we failed on COVID and we lost, or we didn't do, for whatever reason, we lost, and that's it. That responsibility would have prevented all of this. And of course, after the fact, in Trump's inciting of the riot as well, they are completely denying any responsibility whatsoever. But that personal responsibility is not what Sarah Palin is talking about. She says that the problem with personal responsibility is the people who did the rioting aren't taking personal responsibility. Then Sarah Palin makes the case that, listen, the rioters were already there planning chaos. They weren't influenced by Donald Trump at all. And Piers Morgan points out, well, hold on a second. The 2 months of the lie about election fraud from November 4th, that was really the initial catalyst for these people being so whipped up to begin with. This is why they were even there on January 6th. It's a very good point. Sarah Palin doesn't like it.
Also, you have to remember that those who were these rioters, and again, they were horrible and it was a horrible act. They were there already. So many of them were. They weren't like standing in the back of the rally, rooting on patriotically a president's speech. No, they knew what they were going to do. They were going to go storm the Capitol and be jerks.
Yeah, the reason they were going to the reason Sarah Palin they were going to do that is because the president, ever since the result of a fair democratic election, had perpetuated an absolute lie that there had been widespread fraud, which has never been proven at all. It didn't exist. He whipped his mob into a frenzy. He told them to stop the steal. And as the elected officials in Congress were actually ratifying the election, he ordered them to march down to the Capitol and stop the steal. And yeah, some of them may have just got the wrong memo, but you know what? It sounded to me like the president wanted to stop the steal, as he put it, and stop the democratic election being ratified. That, I'm afraid, is a criminal action, isn't it?
Why are you generalizing, though, and making it sound like it was this entire crowd that was so excited?
Because
and
I saw thousands of people.
Now, this is just Rich. Why are you generalizing? She says. Well, he's not generalizing. 75 million people voted for Trump. Piers isn't talking about 75 million people because most of them stayed home on January 6th. Thousands and thousands of people went to the January 6th Trump rally. Piers also isn't talking about all of them because some of them, when the rally was over, turned around and they went to their cars or got on the subway and went home where they came from. He is doing the opposite of generalizing. He's talking specifically about the people who went to the Capitol and were trespassing and vandalizing and being violent. Was it 500 people? Was it 1,500 people? 2,000? We're still trying to figure out the exact number. He's not generalizing at all, and this continues. And Sarah Palin won't even concede that Donald Trump lost. And this is where you really see the full delusion of Sarah Palin. And I know some people are going to write to me and say, David, she seems unwell. She seems like she's not well. And unfortunately, this is the impression we get from a lot of these right-wing loons. So I don't know that that tells us much one way or the other about her politics. But she was asked, Trump didn't win, right? Like Trump lost. And she says, well, I don't know. Take a look.
No,
Sarah, I saw thousands of people. I'm not generalizing. We all saw the scenes.
You did generalize.
I watched thousands of people.
You made it sound like it was the entire crowd.
No, I watched thousands of people storming into the Capitol. We all watched it with our own eyes. It was one of the most grotesque...
But it wasn't the entire crowd, right?
Okay, I'm talking about the thousands who did. And there's no question, they were whipped up to do so because they believed their president, who told them the election had been stolen, fraudulently stolen. That was a lie, wasn't it?
The president has been insisting, so many Americans have been insisting that our elections are run legally and transparently. And when there were shenanigans, obviously, in so many of the polling areas, the president has insisted that we look into where all these votes had come from.
Yeah, but the election wasn't stolen, was it, Sarah Palin? Let's be honest. Let's be clear. The election was won.
There were shenanigans.
Sarah, the election was.
You know how?
The election was won. Let me just say something.
And there always is.
Sarah, the election was won. The election was won fair and square by a thumping win by Joe Biden. Do you accept that?
I want to see that our elections and every polling place is run cleanly. Now, I was a governor.
So she will not admit that. In trying to defend Trump from any blame about people storming the Capitol, she's doing the exact thing that started all of this to begin with, which is she's now been asked twice, did Trump lose? And she's not answering the question, and it continues.
The question was, do you accept the election victory by Joe Biden?
This is crazy. You guys invited me to come on.
No,
let me finish,
it's just that
please.
You didn't answer that part of the question.
You didn't answer my question.
Susie,
if you want to
finish, okay?
Why do you answer the question?
Finish. Now, I'm talking about clean elections. And I know that shenanigans do take place in elections. As a governor, I witnessed that also. And we were always having to crack down through division of elections and the lieutenant governor's office.
Can you answer the question,
the bureaucrats
Sarah?
who are in charge of it. Because, for instance, we had Barack Obama's right-hand man.
Let's not talk about Obama. He hasn't been in... Obama's not been in office for 4 years. Sarah, you can't filibuster us. Now, listen, let's go back to the question. The question was, do you accept that Joe Biden...
Okay, let's go back to the question.
Let me ask you a question, and you answer my question. Look, did Joe Biden...
Let's go back to the first question.
Did Joe Biden win... Did Joe Biden... Let me try and answer a question.
Absolute hysteria. It's incredible that there are layers of hysteria here that we're unable to even get to, because she won't get through the first level of hysteria, like allowing the question to simply be repeated and then giving an answer. Did Joe Biden win? Here's one more attempt.
The rioters on the Capitol.
Did Joe Biden win the election?
Can we please finish what the topic? Why did you just skip on over that?
Because it's at the heart of the issue, isn't it?
The president who is facing impeachment, if he was solely to blame for these criminals and their acts.
I believe he was to blame for the criminals, but I'm asking you, Sarah Palin, whether you believe Joe Biden won the election.
Well, evidently he did, because he's sworn in as our president, but no one will convince me nor anyone else with common sense and a sense of justice. No one will convince us that there were not shenanigans going on.
What were the shenanigans? Explain to me what the... given that nobody has...
Nobody can argue the numbers. You can argue against
Sarah,
the politician, but you cannot argue against the facts.
Given that nobody has produced any facts to prove there was widespread fraud in the election, do you have it now? Can you show us? Can you tell me what...
No, Piers,
where's the fraud?
Piers, stop. Now, don't interrupt me while I finish this point,
Where's the fraud?
Okay? Listen.
Okay,
how many polling areas had to produce their voter rolls, and they showed that there were, say, more votes than there were voters in certain districts?
Where's the fraud, Sarah?
Where's it been upheld?
Is that not?
Where is a single court? Where is a single?
Right there?
Where has a single court in America upheld fraud?
Okay.
In the election?
You're asking if there was fraud. I'm telling you where the shenanigans were. What about all the dead people who voted?
Oh, Sarah,
where was that upheld in court?
I don't know. Sarah, we like you on this program. Sarah.
I like how Piers says he likes her on the program. I find her completely insufferable and corrosive to American politics. He likes her. Okay. More votes than people wasn't demonstrated anywhere. Just because they repeat it doesn't make it true. And then dead people voting. Come on. It's been so widely debunked. Every time it's been investigated, dead people voting were actually a combination of people who were registered but died before the election and didn't vote. Being registered to vote and then dying and not voting isn't a crime. It's not shenanigans. It's not foul play. Clerical errors. Some junior-senior confusion where like a junior voted and the vote was counted as their dad, who might have been dead at the time of the election, but it was still only one vote. It just counted for the wrong person. That's another thing that happened. And then also when, I believe it was Channel 4 in the UK, did an investigation about this, a lot of the people that were just claimed to be dead were actually just alive. And that's happened to me. Remember, I was featured in a documentary about people who were supposedly dead. And I had to put out a statement saying I am very much alive right now. So that is these are all untruths. And this went on and on. There are probably about another 5 or 6 minutes of it. I won't play more, but absolutely horrifying that Sarah Palin was very close to being the vice president of the United States. And had she been vice president, she would have been, as the phrase goes, a heartbeat away from being president of the United States. Really scary stuff. I'd rather her saying crazy things in Alaska than in the White House for sure, but that doesn't make what she's saying any less outrageous. We'll have more of this, including commentary, your commentary, on the David Pakman Show Instagram. Make sure you're following us there at David Pakman Show. We'll take a quick break and be right back.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The number one funding source for the David Pakman Show has been and continues to be membership. And membership is not just a feel-good thing. You get access to the world-famous bonus show every single day just for members, as well as commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show day in and day out. You can sign up for membership very, very quickly at joinpakman.com. That's joinpakman.com. If the normal prices strike you as high, by all means use the coupon code BETTER21, all one word, all lowercase. Become a member today.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today we're going to be speaking to John Mark Hansen, who's a professor in political science at the University of Chicago. We are going to talk a little bit about what would it look like to rig and or steal an American presidential election. Mark, it's great to have you on.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, okay, I mean, at this point, I don't think we have to rehash all of the claims that were made between November 4th and January 6th or January 20th or even up until today and continue to be made. Let's just get into the reality so maybe the audience can understand what would go into this. Could an American presidential election, which is really 50 state elections, could it be rigged? Could it be stolen? How would it have to be done if so?
Well, I would say that it's difficult to the point of impossible. I think many people just don't understand the scale of the effort that would be involved to actually fix a presidential election. You're not talking about a few hundred votes. You're not talking about a few thousand votes. You're talking about tens or even hundreds of thousands of votes spread along a number of states.
So there are folks who will say, well, 80 million votes versus 75 million or whatever. You don't really need to flip millions of votes. You really need, for example, in 2016, it was 77,000 votes in 3 states. In 2020, it was, depending on how you slice it, about 100,000 votes. That's very different than millions. So that presumably would make it simpler.
Simpler, but not by any means simple. If you imagine what it would take to shift a number of votes, and bear in mind that you don't know exactly where the problem is going to be. You don't know exactly what the margin you need is, and you don't know exactly where it's going to be. So you have to start months in advance, and you have to be thinking in terms of tens of thousands of votes. And you have to be thinking about how it is that you would recruit tens of thousands of people to participate in this effort. Without anybody blowing a whistle on you.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate. Maybe you don't need to recruit tens of thousands. If you can just get a few tech people who, quote, control the voting machines, that might be a simple way, and you might only need 5 or 6 people.
Well, that is the case. However, you still have to maintain a conspiracy of those 5 or 6 people. And one of the things we know is it's very difficult to maintain conspiracies. So there are many, many business frauds that go awry, or criminal frauds or criminal activities that go awry because people feel the need to say something, either because they want to boast about it or because they have a guilty conscience or whatever. So you would have to have a great deal of trust in your Confederates. But even beyond that, there are lots and lots and lots of barriers that have been erected to actually manipulating the vote in that way. There are security measures for the technology that's used in voting and vote counting. And moreover, there's the knowledge of the people who are overseeing the voting process. And so if some county comes in all of a sudden with 10,000 more votes than they've ever cast before, someone might say, boy, that looks kind of fishy. Maybe we ought to look closer at that.
There are so many different claims that have been made about mechanisms for subterfuge, some of which conflict with each other. And maybe, I don't know how much we need to necessarily get into that, but just to talk about a few of the different things, there's, as I mentioned, the idea of simply using hacking skills to change the vote tallies of a group of voting machines. We heard stories of so-called massive dumps of ballots coming in the middle of the night on vans and literally just taking boxes of ballots out, which presumably in that case, the voting machines aren't being manipulated, but someone's feeding in a bunch of ballots. There's the idea of having election workers look at ballots and then disqualify only some, presumably to help one candidate and hurt the other. All of these are based on different principles. And what to me seems very difficult would be that you might end up with one of these strategies working against a different one, conflicting. The coordination of such strategies seems extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah, it's enormously difficult. Take, for instance, the idea of a bunch of ballots that get dumped. So most states, most jurisdictions, in fact, allow partisan observers to ballot counting. And so all of a sudden these ballots come in and someone might say, so where did they come from? How do we know that they're authentic? There should be a mark on the ballot. There should be some kind of record that the person at the polling place actually authorized this person to vote. Or if it's an absentee ballot, it should meet the requirements for absentee ballots, which oftentimes include a signature. They include a ballot application, all kinds of things. So there are all kinds of safeguards to prevent ballots from being submitted fraudulently, and certainly all kinds of safeguards to make sure that if there are frauds, that there's a likelihood of their being discovered, particularly on a large scale.
Yeah, when it comes to in-person voter fraud, the idea of someone, I don't even know, sometimes it's not even clear to me exactly how you would do it. You would go to multiple polling places or show up and claim to be a variety of different people. I mean, you wouldn't be registered in multiple places, so going to polling places as you wouldn't work. I guess you could show up and say, at one polling place, you say you're Joe Smith, and at the next place, you say you're Steve Johnson, and that type of thing. But it seems like in order to flip 50,000 votes with that strategy, you need thousands of people, making it incredibly unlikely to be able to do it secretly.
Exactly. Just think about recruiting such a number of people. So somehow you're going to have to find a bunch of people who are willing to take the risk, either to their freedom or to their pocketbook or to their reputations, to participate in all of this. And you're going to have to make sure that you don't reach anybody who has a healthy enough conscience that they would blow the whistle on you.
When it comes to people getting caught attempting to do these things, from looking at the Brennan Center for Justice's work on this, which has looked at over 1 billion votes over I don't know how many years, many years, they say that this in-person voter fraud is not only extremely rare, but there is not even a single case in which it has come close to actually affecting the outcome of a race. Right. There are people who will claim, maybe cynically, maybe not, that just because this Brennan Center gives us these numbers, it doesn't address the number of people that are getting away with it, which simply don't show up when you hear about, 20 people were caught trying to do this. How can we defeat the idea that maybe there are lots of people not caught doing it?
Well, again, I think you have to kind of do the math on it. So any kind of large-scale effort means that the difficulties go up, the costs go up, and the risk of exposure goes up. The more people who are involved in this, the more votes that are involved in this, the greater the likelihood that it's going to be found. So, yeah, maybe there are people who get away with it, but there are people who get away with it maybe affecting 1 or 2 votes. Out of all the scrutiny that this last election got, so far, the only indictment that we've seen for any kind of voting irregularities was a man in Pennsylvania who voted an absentee ballot for his mother,
right,
for Donald Trump. So, that's the typical kind of thing that we see in these cases. Most cases of vote fraud or alleged vote fraud are not even prosecuted because it's people making honest mistakes, right? They thought that they were registered, but they weren't, or they thought that they were eligible in this jurisdiction, but they weren't, or so forth. So most of these cases have quite innocent explanations.
What would be, of all of these different mechanisms, what's the one you're most likely to get away with?
Oh, boy. I'm not sure that there are that many possibilities anymore. Back in the bad old days, there used to be a fair bit of vote fraud. It was committed both by Republicans and by Democrats. And as a result of that, election officials learn through time what those frauds look like. And they learned about how to take security measures to make sure that those frauds didn't occur. And so by now, with a century of experience with the Australian ballot, with the secret ballot, we have lots and lots of experience in this. And it's not like people have just been twiddling their thumbs and saying, oh, me, oh, my, when they encounter problems. They've taken steps to avoid them in the future.
When it comes to the U.S. having these 50 election systems plus D.C., I guess you'd say, it's 51 election systems. One could make the argument that the election is less secure because you have so many different systems. But on the other hand, you could make the argument that having all of these systems actually makes it more secure, because in order to really do some kind of fraud at a big level, you'd have to figure out a way to manipulate multiple different systems. Do you think that having the 51 different systems on balance makes the election more or less secure?
That's a good question. I think you could argue it both ways. Certainly one could argue that if you have separate systems, you might not have all jurisdictions adopting best practices. And that would be an argument for a more uniform system. On the other hand, if it is a matter of some kind of technical expertise to manipulate these systems, then having a wide variety of systems means that you have to have a greater variety of technical expertise in order to do anything significant.
Do you think that because of all of the smears that we've heard over the last 2-3 months about the election of 2020, there's going to be a skepticism about the system in some parts, among some communities, that will last a long time? Or is it as simple as, if in 2022 politicians don't make these claims, people will, generally speaking, trust the systems again?
Well, I think that there is now a partisan reason not to, quote unquote, trust the system. Whether that actually translates into people behaving in a different way, I think, is another question entirely. There are all these concerns in Georgia, for instance, in the Senate runoff, that Donald Trump's casting aspersions on the fairness of the Georgia election would mean that Republicans would stay home. Why?
Right. Then they definitely lose.
Right. Why would you do that? So I'm skeptical that it will matter a whole lot. What it does do, however, is to raise the possibility of just casting doubt on the legitimacy of every election outcome, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah, and that it seemed. I mean, there was a woman who confronted Mitt Romney in an airport a couple of weeks ago, and almost like as a reflexive thing, she said, your election wasn't even legitimate. And like, who, I didn't even know the Utah 2018 election was being challenged in terms of its legitimacy. It seems it's becoming a catch-all for, I don't like that you won.
Yeah, that's right. And this has been brewing for a while. It's been a Republican strategy since 2010, basically to erect more and more barriers to voting, and particularly to the constituencies that tend to vote Democratic, just in order to keep one's opponents away from the polls.
Right.
So, this is actually, and in that respect, the 2020 election was something of an embarrassment because we had easier access to voting than we've ever had before in our history, and we have a whistle clean election. So now what are they going to claim?
Right.
How can they say, well, actually things do work? And so we get a doubling down on these fraud claims. Yeah.
And in fact, Christopher Krebs, who worked for Donald Trump, said exactly that. It was fine, and he was fired. And so we see the political nature that it's taking on. We've been speaking with Professor John Mark Hansen, who teaches political science at the University of Chicago. So great having you on today. I really appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show is audience-supported media, and you can contribute any amount you want on Patreon, as little as $1 per month. Plus, you can get the daily bonus show, world famous at this point, and the daily commercial-free TV show by making those pledges at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. This is audience-supported media. We depend on the support of our viewers and listeners. Whether you listen to the podcast, watch on YouTube, or watch us on TV, or even listen on the radio, patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We're learning more and more about the absolute fury that overtook Donald Trump after seeing one of his two impeachment attorneys yesterday, Bruce Castor, aimlessly wander through his personal background, the political preferences of his parents, praise of senators, a discussion of pre-Revolutionary War British law, really everything but the subject matter of the impeachment during his opening statements yesterday, which lasted about 50 minutes, or rather not opening statements, the opening to the day one proceedings to determine whether the Senate has the jurisdiction to try a president that is no longer in office. As we talked about yesterday, the Senate voted 56-44 that yes, they can have the impeachment trial. There's a report from CNN that Donald Trump was, quote, deeply unhappy with the performance of Bruce Castor. Multiple sources familiar with Trump's reaction said to CNN that Trump was borderline screaming as Bruce Castor was failing humiliatingly, embarrassingly on global television yesterday. And particularly was upset that those opening remarks from Bruce Castor were rambling. Trump's team also was reportedly confused about the last-minute decision to swap the order of his defense. Castor, who did the 50 minutes of rambling first, was actually scheduled to speak after David Schoen, and people around Trump thought that this new idea of having Bruce Castor go first wasn't a particularly strong idea. Now, of course, they were right. How much of it is hindsight bias, I don't know. But they say that Donald Trump was particularly upset when the first thing Bruce Castor said when he got up there was, the House managers, the prosecution, did a really great job. And of course, it was true. It was true that they did a good job, but it's not typically what you want your defense counsel to be admitting. The New York Times also had a report in which they said that Castor getting up there and praising the impeachment managers was not well received by Donald Trump. And they reported that some of Trump's legal team were actually surprised that there would be raw video shown from the January 6th riots. This, to me, we said, when your own legal team misspells United States as Unitas States, that should be a signal that maybe they're not playing with a full deck when it comes to preparation. And Democrats had been saying for days, we are going to show video of the riots. Trump's defenders were saying, well, Trump's lawyers are going to show videos at some point of Democrats calling for violence. Okay, well, so everybody knows what to expect. But reportedly, Trump's legal team was surprised that there was video of the riots shown. I sort of half jokingly, 5% jokingly said during the proceedings yesterday, does Bruce Castor get fired today by Donald Trump? Apparently, it's actually something Trump is considering. The Daily Beast was told by a source familiar with what was going on that Donald Trump is considering pulling Bruce Castor from the legal team altogether, which would put everything on, in particular on David Schoen, which would be a lot of work, to say the least. As far as the schedule goes, the impeachment trial is expected to go through the week and into next week. There are going to be 8 hours of presentations from the House managers, 8 hours of presentations from Trump's defense counsel. There will then be, it's either 4 hours total or 4 hours per party of questions for the impeachment managers and defense counsel. And then there will also be closing statements. So I'm expecting at least into Monday or Tuesday, although these things change so quickly that the plan may change relatively soon. Trump furious with Bruce Castor. Understandable why. Why can't Trump just get people who are adequately prepared to represent him in a way that's not embarrassing? Maybe it's because a lot of lawyers know they're probably not going to get paid by Trump since he stiffs people on legal bills. I don't really know the answer, but it just will not stop. We had another yesterday in the rush to get this first day of Trump's second impeachment trial out live on all of our platforms. I did not cover the White House press briefing with Press Secretary Jen Psaki. And yes, I will address my pronunciation of Psaki in the voicemail segment today. And reporters just will not stop asking really dumb questions. Here is a reporter asking Jen Psaki, does Joe Biden plan on hanging up a painting of Donald Trump in the White House? Of course, Donald Trump not hanging a painting of Obama, as is often done of the prior president. In the midst of everything that's going on in week 3 of Joe Biden's administration, Jen Psaki asked, what about Joe Biden's view on a Trump painting in the White House?
President Trump, former President Trump, he broke tradition by not having his predecessor have a portrait hanged up here. That, as far as I understand, that was something that was considered totally the normal thing to do. Will President Biden be inviting his predecessor to hang up a portrait somewhere? And will he get the Obamas back in to finally get their ceremony?
I have no portrait revealings or portrait plans or portrait events to preview for you, but I have not been given any indication that we would break with tradition in that regard.
So not a major issue, as you can imagine. I really don't know what's up with some of these questions. It's not completely clear to me because they're not necessarily coming from reporters with bad reputations or from whom we would expect this. I mean, Peter Doocy, yes, we know what he's trying to do and get sound bites for right-wing media, but some of these are not reporters that have particularly bad reputations or are known to have bad intentions. But these questions simply will not stop. Now, here's a bonus clip. I mentioned Peter Doocy. Peter Doocy asking a question. This is just unbelievable. Irony is dead. Peter Doocy asked about conflicts of interest for Joe Biden. You really can't make this up. Joe Biden's son-in-law was advising Biden on vaccine response at some earlier point. Here is Peter Doocy continuing to try to make a name for himself with supposedly tough questions of Jen Psaki, and he brings this up. Take a listen.
Quick one on conflicts of interest and some reporting that's been done by our colleagues at other networks. The president's son-in-law, Dr. Howard Krein, was advising candidate Biden on COVID-19 response while he was investing in companies involved with the COVID-19 response through his company, Startup Health. Dr. Krein has been at the White House since the inauguration. Is he still advising the president on COVID-19 response?
Well, Dr. Krein is his son-in-law. The president...
There are questions about a potential conflict
Well, and
of
I think
interest.
he was here because the president was inaugurated recently, which is understandable. The president has made clear that there will be an absolute wall between him and any businesses connected with his family members. And as he reiterated just last week, no family member is going to have an office in the White House or be involved in any government policymaking. That applies to his son-in-law and applies to every single member of his family.
This guy was there for the inauguration. He's not working for the White House. How can they pretend to care about conflicts of interest now? We just learned Jared and Ivanka, in positions not confirmed by the Senate nor elected by the people, were working in the White House and made between $200 and $600 million while working at the White House for those 4 years. Now, sadly, we expected this, and unfortunately, it does work on a lot of people. Millions of Trump supporters who never cared about conflicts of interest for the last 4 years will fixate on this stuff. And in that sense, it's not stupid for Fox News to do it for their audience. They look like complete fools to most of the world and the country. But for much of their audience, this is how they generate narratives and create agendas. But what about this? What about this vaccine advice? Where were you when Ivanka was making millions from handbags and working for Trump, and Kellyanne Conway was promoting the handbags on Fox News? Where were you then? Well, they were nowhere because they didn't care. And it's not about principle. It's merely about what can we say to try to attack Joe Biden. And unfortunately, for the low information Fox News audience, the OAN types, the Newsmax types, this may well be compelling, and it's how you generate narrative. Hey, so I've been, I guess, struggling with how to pronounce the name of Joe Biden's White House press secretary, and I got yet another voicemail admonishing me about it. Remember, our voicemail number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Take a listen.
Hello, David. This is a fan. My name is Sue, and I mean this in the most kindly way. Since you will be pronouncing the White House press secretary's name hundreds of times, I would suggest that you pronounce it correctly.
Yes.
It's Jen Psaki with a soft A instead of Psaki. Jen Psaki. Bye-bye.
So at the beginning, I would say Jen Psaki, and then a few people wrote to me and said, David, it's Psaki. So I switched to Psaki, and then over the weekend, I got a dozen emails saying, David, it's Psaki. And now I'm being told it's Psaki. I am going to pronounce it Psaki, and the reason why is that Jen Psaki recently did an interview with a longtime friend of hers, and he pronounced it Psaki. I assume he knows how it's said, so I'm going to be pronouncing it Jen Psaki until someone explains to me a good reason why I should reverse course once again. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We've got resignations. We've got Black History Month drama in Utah schools. We've got more statements about the lab hypothesis of the coronavirus. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get instant access by signing up at joinpakman.com. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Unbiased News is a myth. Ground News is a news comparison platform that empowers you to see how the political biases of different sources are influencing the news you read. Download the Ground News app for free at davidpakman.com/ground.